This is the London FinTech Podcast, brought to you by your host, Mike Ballerman, bridging the worlds of suits and t-shirts, of finance and technology, bringing you insights, stories, and inspiration from the golden age of opportunity and innovation happening in London right now.
Hi, this is Mike Ballerman, and this is London FinTech Podcast, episode 172, brought to you in association with Smart Pension and the enlistedboard.com. And I'm delighted to be joined today by Tony Clark, CEO of NextWave, a next-generation consulting firm to discuss the changing world of FS projects. As we heard recently, Lloyd's of London has struggled for decades with its IT infrastructure, but with Blueprint 2, as Andy Rea explained, it sounds like they've made a successful and radical change of direction. Back in the day, when I joined the city a millennium ago, computers were not seen very much at all and were predominantly for back office and administrative functions. And IT itself was a back office function. Of course, there have been huge advances in technology over the intervening decades, and how technology is used, and so-called digital, is merely the most recent wave in this. In this techophilia world, however, less attention has been given to how one structures and approaches projects in the vast organisations that FS firms have become. Many of them are now well into the hundreds of thousands of employees, and implementing successful IT projects in those is a radically different challenge from implementing one in your fintech of a dozen or 100 or even 400 people. Tony has over 30 years experience of FX projects in the city, and thus speaks some deep experience of how all this has changed and how it is continuing to change. His premise is that major FS organisations need essentially a phase change of approach to be at the leading rather than trailing edge of leveraging the digital world. Plenty to talk about, so let's get on with the show. Good morning, Tony. Thank you for joining me on the show today.
Hi Mike, it's great to be here.
And in terms of kicking things off, you and I have been very successful in that there is significantly less of us than there was sort of a year or two ago.
Well, in my case, perhaps a stone or so.
So what's that in modern money?
few kilos.
I'm down 10 kilos actually.
Yeah, so I think I'm 6 or 7. But I guess lockdown could have gone either way. But in our case, we've shed a few pounds.
Yes, and I think our secret in that, because we presumably cannot be the only people in the world who, when suddenly sort of confined to our study and sitting motionless day in, day out for a whole year, have not managed to get out and on rainy days. I think the useful tip there for listeners is intermittent fasting that we've both done. In particular, I'd put a link in the show notes. Dr. Jason Fung, there's a 2-minute video by him, is super clear on this, in that the old school mentality of calories in, calories out is pretty much defunct, largely because that considers the human being as an engine. So, for example, wood has got calories, but if you and I eat wood, we ain't going to put any weight on. So it's something more than just calories. And in particular, it's a hormonal thing, and as Jason Fung has made very clear, and many others, but I think he's just one of the best. Diabetes is driven by high insulin, and the fact that high insulin and diabetes around the world shows that something's going wrong with people's diets. But insulin is a hormone. The level of your insulin drives whether your body stores the incoming calories as fat or not. If you have high insulin in general, which you probably do if you had a carby diet for a long time, perhaps like we have, then you will lay down fat. If you have a low insulin level, then you will burn fat. It's literally as simple as that. So in my case, we skip breakfast and we skip booze Monday to Thursday, and literally, don't bother at the weekend with this stuff. And literally I've lost 10 kilos in a year. I mean, you've done something very similar, haven't you?
Yes, I have, Mike. So, I've been an occasional advocate of various diet approaches over the years. I mean, starting with something that was written by a Frenchman called Michel Montignac, which I was attracted to because it was all about steaks and red wine. And there have been various flavours of diets in between. But it's undoubtedly the major factor. And actually, as we went into lockdown, my wife, who has a habit of sort of cutting through things with a very clear statement, said, just don't have breakfast. And so I thought, well, is that even possible? And then I realised that you can substitute with a couple of strong espressos, and I'd give it a go. And I only discovered afterwards that it was a thing, and the thing is intermittent fasting. So this idea of 16-8 and not eating during the 16 hours, you can achieve that by indeed skipping breakfast. So I don't know whether the medical community would endorse that approach particularly, but it actually worked for me. And so during lockdown 1, I trimmed down a bit.
Excellent. Well, yes, the medical community, well, there isn't such a thing as the medical community as we see on roughly everything at the moment, but Jason Fung is a good example. I mean, all the evidence is precisely along these lines, and I think that when I've spoken to many people say, I couldn't miss breakfast or whatever, well, I used to be like that as well. I used to also, I can't miss my coffee. But the way to do it is to have your dinner a bit earlier and just have your breakfast half an hour later every day. You won't particularly notice. Then after a while, you're having your breakfast at 11. You think, forget it, I'll have an early lunch at 12. So anyway, so that's the pain-free way of doing it. Now, having sort of put myself on a level of moral equivalence with you, I now have to sort of step off the pedestal, because I still do sort of just sit on my derriere far too much the entire day because it's raining and therefore I can't be bothered to go out. But you've gone a step further, and one of your other pro tips for listeners who might be interested is that, rather curiously, you've employed a man to come around and shout at you in the morning, which, if that was all he was doing, would be a bit strange, but there's more to it, isn't there?
Yeah, well, I think you're referring to the early morning gym sessions. That shouting now happens over an iPad.
Shouting spreads COVID.
Yes, indeed. Well, we used to do this at a very small gym around the corner from my house, but 3 times a week at 6 a.m. is not everyone's idea of best way to start the day. But I've been doing this for a little while, and it just kickstarts body and mind. But to the earlier point, it doesn't work without the dietary thing. So you can sort of lift as much weight as you like, and it really doesn't make any difference until you start looking at what you're eating as well.
Yes, a mate of mine some time ago was doing some gig at the BBC, and he was cycling from Islington to Shepherd's Bush and back every day. Hell of a long cycle ride, over which period he put on weight.
Indeed, yeah.
It is more than just sort of simple calories in, calories out. Well, I think it shows, because you look disgustingly fit and healthy. I mean, I'm very pleased that you're fit and healthy, but I feel sort of rather guilty.
Thank you, Mike.
I'm not. And in all seriousness, in terms of now having seen the fintech revolution over the last sort of 6 years in very close detail, but also having seen the world of business over decades, I think that one thing that it's very easy to neglect with the pressures, whether in a small company or a big company, there are always pressures. With the pressures on people, it's very easy to let all this stuff go, which is, of course, why the likes of you and I needed to lose weight and all that in the first place. And with my obsession about boards these days, if I've got some sort of entrepreneur approaching me to do a gig or something and help them out over the longer term, then actually how well they take care of themselves is, to me, the prime measure. I can think of people in fintech, not mentioning any names, where because of the pressures, they've eaten too much, they've drunk too much, they haven't exercised, and then, it doesn't really help you digest the stress in a way. And in terms of the old school city, before the days of fintech, I did a meditation retreat, I think 28 years ago, and there was some hotshot derivatives trader on the meditation retreat. He'd made millions in his early 20s already, and the pressure got to him. And I used to eat lots of biscuits in my fixed income meetings. That was my way of coping with stress, which is probably why I got the highest in. Anyway, he's not that amusing, and this chap tried more and more, shall we say, strong methods of dealing with stress, and in the end injected himself with too much heroin, had a heart attack, and found himself from being a hotshot derivatives trader making millions into literally being on a hospital ward at the age of 23, surrounded by a bunch of prisoners. So that is an extreme case, but it's all the same direction. If you keep overloading yourself with stress and don't somehow digest it, whether it's meditation, whether it's yoga, or whatever, then in the end, you're going to be the weak link in your own chain.
Yeah, I can only agree. One of my former bosses used to talk about the lean enterprise, and I think he was talking more about efficiency in the business, perhaps. But for us as humans and keeping a good body-mind balance, super important, especially given that we're all now remote working and reacting to the pandemic. So the themes of resilience and emotional engagement and motivation in this world that we find ourselves in now couldn't be more important, actually. And I think we'll talk a bit about the shape of the market and some of the things we're seeing, but that's one of the things we talk to our clients about a lot now.
Yes, and so you and I haven't quite, well, you will have, but I haven't conquered the mental stamina part of it. But I mean, I did my little shop to Waitrose yesterday, which sort of passed my social life yesterday, other than seeing Bridget and chatting to the checkout girl. And I was saying that actually the one thing I miss at the moment is I'm used to looking forward to going skiing. And when it's January and February and it's all dragging on, having something to look forward to is really useful. And she was saying, yes, she by now has normally booked some holiday and she looks forward to it. And now she has nothing to look forward to. So there's all sorts of insidious pressures on us. So we need to get up and shape up. Okay, anyway, so 2 ideas to the listeners there is that Tony and I have found that sort of simply missing breakfast sorts the weight out over time. And I've got chums as well that also tried the sort of the personal trainer thing and they swear by it too. And one of the things I think it does is that it passes, you delegate the problem to somebody else. Otherwise, as an individual, you have to use your willpower for all these things. I won't eat breakfast, I won't drink alcohol in the week, I will take exercise, I will grow my business, I will do that. But the willpower is finite. Okay, so talking of bosses, you've had bosses and you've been a boss for quite some time. So briefly then, Tony, what's your career journey that's brought you to where you are today? And then we'll dive into the main course.
Thanks, Mike. So in my case, I started out with Accenture actually when it was called Anderson Consulting, so in the 90s, and I was there for 9 years. And Accenture's a very well regarded firm. It's itself evolved over time, but I started out Cobol programming in boot camp, and then going to work for one of the very well known UK retail banks. And I remember being on my first client projects back there on a greenfield technology site, which had a fully licensed bar on site. And we'd sometimes lose some of the team because lunchtime had extended a little bit longer than it needed to. Times have changed a bit since, but that was a great grounding for me. And I was there for quite some time. I was there for 9 years, but then span out and helped to build my first boutique consulting firm. It's a firm called MA Partners. And that was a successful journey for nearly 10 years. And we had an exit.
Which in passing, talking about amazing how these connections come round, which in passing, I happened to have lunch with one of your chums and provide you with the chairman, actually. And this is quite some time ago.
Indeed. Bit of shared history. So I think that's sort of wind forward to just before the financial crash, and we had a successful exit with MA 2007, and then briefly were part of a firm that was really doing data science and data engineering and big data, 10 years ahead of the rest of the sector, really getting a hold of the concept as the way we see it now. And that firm, Detica as was, then became part of BAE Systems, which is a huge defence, security and intelligence organisation. And I think they really wanted the spooky side of the business, not the capital markets consulting side of the business. And there was a day a year or two into this that I discovered that our part of the business was on the bottom branch of the org chart, and it was under the submarine division. It was actually the division. So that's when I think you're underwater and it's time to do something else.
I was hoping you're going to tell that story about how your consultancy ended up as part of a submarine division, because I don't think it was you, but I bumped into one of your chums in the city. And I remember, I said, how's it going? He said, oh, it's great. He said, we're part of the submarine division.
Yes.
Fantastic.
So at which point, with the market where it was at the time, the commercial part of that business was pretty much hived down, and we span out and created something called Crossbridge Consulting, which I always liked the name because it was we always talked about having 1 foot in business, 1 foot in technology, and I think this plays to what we're doing now and what we're seeing in the market. Consulting it was always technology enabled at some level, and Accenture have been obviously very adept at leading the charge on this. So at Crossbridge, we worked with quite a number of big brand tier 1 banks and financial services firms. That's always been my sector, and that firm was a successful boutique through to 2015, and we had another exit. So Crossbridge was acquired, and I spent the last 5 years really in much more of a scale up, which was running the UK regional business for a firm called Synchron.
Former brand partners of the London FinTech podcast, of course.
You can see there's a few touch points here. And the Synchron focus is more overtly, it's a bigger enterprise, 10,000 heads across 19 countries, but it's much more overtly progressive tech and digital. So I sort of grew up being a techno-functional business and technology consultancy, and then spent the last 5 years really focusing on enterprise teams and enterprise solutions with a strong focus on new technology and enterprise technology build.
Okay, well, we'll come on to the most recent chapter in your story a little bit in the dessert course. You're still very close to Synchron, who I think are one of your partners at the moment. You can tell us a little bit more about Next Wave. But let's take a step back, and given that you've described to us the sort of various structures you've been in over the last 30 years, one way or another, man and boy, you've been deeply involved in FS projects and therefore seen them quite a lot. Now, I think it might be quite helpful, even for the techies, the younger techies who don't have the perspective, but for people who aren't in tech or in projects in the city, if we start off this by a little bit of a brief history of the decades that I've been talking about, from the sort of Cobol programmers of the sort of 60s and 70s through the 80s and the 90s and noughties, sort of briefly about how IT was seen and how projects were structured. So give us a little bit of background to then examining in more detail what the current challenges are, what you see the solutions being, and what the future is. But let's give a little bit of sort of background and context to all this.
Sure, and I think to answer that one, Mike, it's important just to understand the environment we're operating in. So when I talk about financial services clients, we're talking about, in my case anyway, major banks, buy-side organisations, asset and wealth managers, and infrastructure, the exchanges, and other service providers in the sector. So it's pretty broad financial services, but most of what I've done is with banks, and a lot of that's been in the capital market space. And some of those firms are no longer around. So I remember doing a startup investment bank that was born out of the ashes of Barings Bank, and worked for firms like Bear Stearns along the way. A lot of things have changed, and some of those companies no longer around. One thing is very true is that the sector is continually reinventing itself, as we can see, and I think the pace of that reinvention is only accelerating. So to your question anyway, sort of history of FS projects. I'll see if I can do that in sort of less than 2 minutes. As I said, in my case, I started out Cobol programming, and for those who know the technology stacks, I mean, we're talking about mainframe computers and DB2 databases, and languages like Cobol. And the new thing at the time was this thing called client server, and the projects were all very lengthy, big program initiatives in a waterfall linear delivery model. And you sort of wind forward through the technology architecture evolution and the evolution of the enabling infrastructure that's out there. You know, I'm skipping a few chapters, but I think what's interesting is the foundation for where we find ourselves now, which is something that's been written up quite accurately, I think, as social, mobile, analytics and cloud, which is really the sort of cornerstones of the modern technology environment and the world that we're now operating in.
Pressing pause there and just rewinding over one thing which I think is, just to pick up my model of phase change, which I think is quite relevant for the phase change. You talk about the original sort of waterfall methodology, or as I say, command and control kind of army type approach. You've got a project manager and they work out plans and they delegate and they delegate and they delegate. That model. The one you skipped over, which I think is quite nice because that's a phase change in itself and predates all this sort of digitally cloudy stuff, is the whole sort of agile rapid development-y stuff, which is a different way of seeing projects. And from what little I've seen from the outside or anecdotes I've heard, that can work very well in certain sort of scales and is used tremendously. But I'm not entirely sure that it always works on a massive scale because you can't sort of rewind the mistakes you've made.
Yes, indeed. Agile and DevOps are the default sort of modus operandi for our clients now.
And sorry, DevOps meaning?
Development operations, continuous build and automation in the software lifecycle. But how well they've landed in the massive FS institutions is an interesting question. I mean, there's a couple of things. I mean, I had one client a few years ago who called me up and said, we've just had a message from the top, and all the senior directors in our part of the business, we've all been told we're product owners. And he said, what is that? What is a product owner? So you have that debate, and then thinking about the cadence of digital product and service delivery, moving from waterfall to, as you said, agile, which is iterative and sprint based, and you cut it into small pieces and course correction as you go. How do you marry that with an annual planning cycle that tends to set budgets on a yearly basis and is used to major releases yearly, or if you're lucky, half yearly or quarterly release cycles? So there's a whole new way of working that needs to cascade across the organisation. And if you look in the middle of what's happened with all of that, in the sort of journey from as it was back then to where we find ourselves now, we've also got the question of offshoring and the advent of open source and a whole plethora of new tools which are used to do modern software development and product delivery, and also to run those modern enterprises on. So the environment is completely changed.
So I mean, I'm not anywhere near like as close to it as you. However, over the last couple of decades, I have myself been involved in this, notably reforming and restoring Landsbank's whole global risk systems and stuff like that, as well as the fact that actually, in terms of other touch points, you and I found ourselves in the same organisation in Canary Wharf on completely different things at the same time by chance. And I think one of the things which is the kind of theme behind my curiosity to hear you explain more about this is that it just seems to me from the outside, and again, there is some benefit from the sort of the older or wiser perspective, which is that over the past few decades, technologies have just absolutely sort of cascaded out all over us. You know, it's been the best time to be in IT if you like bright, new, sexy, shiny things and languages and everything. Just tons of that stuff. But as you were saying about, you know, the chap in the organisation said, someone just told me I'm now a product owner or whatever, but what on earth is one of them? What has lagged behind, and this may well lead into your sort of next wave thing later, is that the human being sort of mini societies in organisations' ability to adapt and reform their management structures and operational structures has really been struggling to keep pace. And so presumably, in a sense, the quote's real problem is not that new technologies have come. If all the things that we've spoken about had come once every 50 years, there'd be plenty of time to digest, I don't know, laptops, plenty of time to digest cloud. But actually these things have just flooded out. And so presumably in terms of the challenges that this creates, from your perspective, one of the main challenges is not to do with the technology per se, is not to do with the new Lego box, but is to do with the organisations. How do we handle these millions of Lego blocks that have suddenly been thrown at us? It's like when you're a kid. When you're a kid, if you just have your green blocks and your red blocks and your mum buys you a blue block for Christmas, you can integrate it. But then somebody suddenly throws you 1,000 bits. You end up going, what?
Well, Mike, I couldn't agree more, but I think it's actually more to do with the changing shape of the market. So it's not just that there's more toys in the toolbox. It's actually the market, right? And I saw surveys a couple of years back that said 73% of millennials don't recognise themselves in the adverts from financial services companies. And it's like, okay, so there's a whole generation of consumer that you might be filtering based on demographic, but actually they identify with something completely different, which is generally, purpose and passions and their social network. And the customer base indeed has moved to social. So we come from a world where your customers were a linear list of if it's B2B firms that you reach out to, and perhaps more of a one-to-one or a broadcast advertising model where you're reaching out to customers. And actually that market is now an ecosystem. So they all talk to each other on social forums and they're all influencing each other, and you have to take a networked approach to touching your customers. And then the point that you touched on, which is the enabling technology and business models. Back in the day, back in my Cobol days, the board would set a direction for the business and choose a strategy and tell the CIO to go and build it. And it was a bit transactional in that sense. Now, it's almost the other way around. It's certainly a loop, because if you're not aware of the technology enablers and what you can do with some of the contextual data technology or low-code technology or some of the things that are now available, then you'll miss a whole business model and a whole opportunity. So the whole business is much more tech-enabled and needs to be tech-aware. We've written pieces about the risk professional of the future or the finance professional of the future, and it's interesting to reflect on the skills for that job when we were growing up versus what the skills are now. And if you scratch the surface of most of the progressive financial services firms, you'll find that there's a whole cadres of staff who are now all learning to Python program, and it's it's no longer about Excel. It's actually being able to code is actually becoming it's not mandatory, but it's important.
Yes, I stand corrected. I'd been overly focusing, you're quite right, on just the sort of the new Lego blocks and the new toys that are coming along for the IT department to play with. But actually, to take the opposite approach and to expand from what you're saying, the challenge for large organisations in implementing their projects, and also for small organisations or growing organisations in the middle, is that everything has changed.
Yes.
As you say, their customers have changed, their competitors have changed, their suppliers have changed, and in terms of the podcast, I do remember this thing called fintech. Those can be competitors, they can be suppliers, they can be customers, and indeed they can be all three in the same organisation.
Yeah.
Of the large organisation. So one of the challenges is not just the internal organisation of, quotes, an IT project or some sense of distributing that out so people do sort of more than Excel on their little sort of desktop machine, but it's really a question of how on earth earth do you operate in this massively confusing ecosystem? And not just how do you bloody survive without sort of going under for the third time and drowning, but how do you leverage? How do you profit? If I suddenly get transported into, I don't know, being CIO or COO of some sort of vast mega bank, then I'd have to sit down and scratch my head for a little bit thinking, blimey, oh, the last 6 odd years, I spoke to a hell of a lot of good companies out there. How? I don't know. How on earth would I work with all them? How does my organisation work with all them as well? It's a hell. It's kind of a multi-dimensional problem that's almost impossible to sort of analyse.
It certainly is, and we think of business agility being enabled by the technology agility and just navigating that whole sort of multi-dimensional space. I mean, you talked about competitors who might now be partners. There's a great story I remember of a property-backed lender, Lendinvest, who started out as a little startup doing that, and then wind forward. They were seen as an upstart and potentially a threat to the big banks. And then a couple of years later, you learn that HSBC and Goldman Sachs had given them hundreds of millions of dollars to lend on their behalf as a distribution partner. So that was a model that completely turned on its head. But, just switching back to your question about challenges, I think of speed to market has never been more important. So the pivot to digital off the back of the pandemic has just accelerated everything. So that was happening anyway. Every firm that we spoke to is on a digital transformation journey. That new dynamic in the market, the new customer base who will actually consciously go out of their way not to talk to a call center because they'd rather have a digital experience. There's only one way of travel with that. So how do you adapt to a rapidly changing market and bring new products to market? So that's what sort of challenge number one. Are there enabling technologies that let you do things quicker? Then it's how do you navigate that whole ecosystem of enabling fintechs and regtechs, because there's thousands of them out there. I remember trade shows a few years back where there were 5 or 6 competing firms who all come up with passport scanning for KYC, and you thought, well, there's a sort of a widget that adds some value, but how does that fit into a bigger enterprise? But today, those platform technologies and component technologies, several of them have matured, way beyond those early days, and are now being plugged in as enablers for new products and services by the tier one firms, and that's really where we're focusing. Our consultancy and orchestration focus is really around some of those maturing component technologies. And once you've chosen sort of what your strategy is and what you're going to plug in, so you've navigated where you get business value and business outcomes from those pieces of the puzzle, it's like, how do you onboard your innovation partners, your platform and services partners at digital pace? Because the enterprise as was, and certainly in our experience, is not set up for that, right? I've got clients who've actually consciously created fintech and partnership procurement roles for the purpose of insourcing these sort of services at anything like the sort of speed that they would like to be adopted. But the legacy processes around some of that supplier onboarding remain in very many firms, and you can have an ambition to do something, but it just gets stuck in the logistics and the contractuals.
Right. Okay. So look, it's even more vastly of a headache than I'd sort of previously conceived it of. So in terms of a Gedanken, I go to bed as normal this evening, and a Kafka novel strikes. And if I wake up tomorrow as a beetle, I can give you a call, you'll hear click, 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 click over the phone, you'll think, what's Mike saying, click, click, click? And I will have a problem because I will be a beetle. But at least it will be a relatively straightforward problem that, this is life as a beetle, and a beetle's life is quite simple. But in an alternative universe where Kafka rewrites his novel, and I wake up tomorrow as a CIO of Megabank, I've got far more problems, and I call you, and this time I don't go click, 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 because I can still speak. And I say, Tony, we recorded that podcast yesterday, and I was listening to you, and I thought, blimey, there's a million more headaches than I realised. What are you doing this afternoon? Can you pop round and see me? I've got mega budgets, so I can make it worth your while, and that kind of stuff. We can't, in the space of a few minutes, lay out the solution to all of these multi-dimensional aspects of how business in its entirety has got to change as a result of digital. But if you're to come around and see me tomorrow afternoon and say, well, actually, look, I think there are 2 key themes here, Mike, you need to focus on and doing things differently. What would those be? What are some of the simple solutions? I'm not asking you how to reform the entire megabank overnight or something, but what can be done? What is the phase change that's required?
Well, first up, I think finding guidance and advisory that can help navigate through all the things that we've been talking about.
So I've done that. I've called you, so I now want the guidance and the advisory.
Okay. So I think firms need to think about the destination and what the enabling architecture might be for that. So at a platform level, it's about data access and data leverage. It's about APIs. It's about moving to cloud. It's about ingesting the right fintechs and regtech firms. So with your trusted advisor, finding the right component parts and drawing out a target model to get there, and that can be consciously done. That can be a process of sitting down and blueprinting and building a roadmap. And then you also need to look at the organisation, because we touched on this. The advent of enabling technologies and new future architectures and new ways of working. This is all about the cultural change, the upskilling, the talent programs, and if you can harness the organisation and get everyone pointing in the same direction with the same excitement and motivation about what you're building, then that is an essential ingredient to making progress with the overall sort of re-architecture and transformation ambition, if you will. So I think you need to look at it at a business and technology operating model and component perspective with a target in mind, but you also need to look at the organisation. And some of the work we're doing with clients is actually around coaching for successful transformation and team performance and remote engagement. The stats bear out that when you actually place a conscious focus on things like that, resilience and engagement, that it has a cascade effect into the success of your delivery initiatives and the overall health of the business.
Excellent. Okay, well, as I haven't woken up as either a Beatle or a CIO, that all sounded brilliant, but I hope there isn't an exam at the end, because I won't be able to remember it all. But from a more sort of chairman-like perspective, it seems to me that my key takeaway from this is that if I do wake up as a CIO tomorrow, then I do need to speak to 2 or 3 potential trusted partners. It's a bit like needing a mountain guide in some complex mountain range. Going back to the changes over the last 35 years plus, back in the day, IT projects were done by the IT department, 100% of whom were sort of permanent employees of the organisation. And in a fairly finite world, that worked as well as it needed to work for the time. But these days, I can certainly see in listening to that one of the things that one needs is sort of grey hair or no hairy people who have got decades experience and seen a number of organisations. I think the one thing I should not try and do as a CIO is reinvent the wheel, is solve all the problems for myself, but is actually to try and find a guide/guides to help me navigate through this landscape. So I think for me that's the key takeaway. So maybe that's a good point, because presumably you're going to explain how Next Wave is precisely the guide or guides in this complex environment. I don't know, but as you've just created this business a year or so ago, I presume that this is all part of your thinking. But before we wrap up the show, I'd like to thank all the listeners out there, my brand partner for the podcast, Smart Pension, who are fast, secure and free. Check out their UK workplace pensions at autoenrollment.co.uk. The unlistedboard.com, resources to help you start making your board an engine of growth today. And just to reiterate my shout out from the last episode on something completely different, but the shout out survives. I'm very keen to do what little I can to try and make the world a better place in the first quarter, given all the pressures we're under. And I set up a clarity.fm line. So it's clarity.fm/Mike Balliman/LFP. And within reason, listeners who want 30 minutes free mentoring in the first quarter of this year on getting from where you are to having a more entrepreneurial board, or understanding more about FS or FinTech, or C-suite mentoring, or for this purposes, business mentoring. Any of you, please do reach out to me at clarity.fm/Mike Balliman/LFP, and I shall give you 30 minutes of trying to give you some helpful advice, and thereby, hopefully by the end of the quarter, having helped the odd listener on their career journey themselves. So, Tony, passing over to you about Next Wave and where you are now and where you're going in the future, what takeaways do you want to give the listeners?
We've moved from market of open banking to open finance and really open everything, which I think is a great theme. And so Next Wave is all about being a connected consultancy and joining the dots for our clients so that they can get business advantage from what's going on in the tech and the FS evolution. And it's all about speed. It's all about platform ecosystems. I've seen research that suggests that average tier one bank is using 200 to 300 fintech services or platforms currently, that by 2023 there'll be 500 million digital apps out there in the world, which is as much as the same amount was developed in the entirety of the last 40 years. So there aren't even enough developers in the world to build that many apps. So then you start thinking about things like low code, which is really Lego bricks, assembling applications from pre-built widgets and components, so you don't have to go back to writing thousands of lines of code from scratch to build enterprise applications. So, what's the future going to look like? I think low code will go mainstream. I think contextual data intelligence, which is something that we work very closely with one of our partners, Quantex, on, will also become much more of a thing. The power of networking data and using that to drive business intelligence and insight, it's already horizontal across progressive firms, but that's only going to continue. And I think this connected consulting model is going to be something that's already capturing a lot of interest. It's going to be something that's actually going to be increasingly adopted to help clients deliver on their business objectives. So I think that's my sort of perspective on the future. Mike, if I was going to leave you with sort of 2 or 3 things for the listeners, if you're struggling with how do I get business outcomes from new technology faster, cheaper and better, we'd love to share some perspectives on that. For your point about grey hairs, our whole positioning is really putting transformational tech in the hands of experienced industry experts, and there aren't many firms that are putting that front and centre. There's a lot of traditional firms that are consulting organisations who've got that focus on the periphery, but really this is all that Next Wave is all about. And I'd say don't neglect engagement, team performance and the ways of working. Those cultural factors really are the enablers. We'd love to hear from anyone who want to either talk about some of the business solutions that we're now developing, or perhaps the navigational aspects of where do I go from here.
And how do people find Next Wave or reach out to you?
Well, nxwave.com or on LinkedIn.
nxwave.com and Tony Clark on LinkedIn. Right, okay, so I think that's been really useful, Tony, as I started the introduction with looking back a few decades, almost 4 now, time goes by. I started my life in a software engineering firm and compilers and that kind of stuff back in 1983. And I have seemed to have stumbled and done some of the right things in my life by mistake, of course. And one of the good things I seem to have done is actually to have got out of technology, because it was nice and simple back in the day. So a bearer of small brain like me could cope with it. But it's now hellishly complex. And as I said before, one of the things I get from talking to you is that in a hellishly complex environment, you need a guide, whether it is you helping large projects or on the difficulties of dealing with boards and something like that with me. And one of the things about the modern world is leveraging the experience and knowledge of people who have got a lot of experience in these environments and thereby saving you a hell of a lot of time. So that's very fascinating, and I wish you every success in the future.
Thank you very much, Mike.
Thanks for listening. If you have any challenges or needs with your unlisted company board, get in touch with me at mike@londonfintechpodcast.com.
We could sit in a band there all day, watching the firelight dance, watching the firelight dance. We could walk in the mountains before dawn, watching a happy moon ride, watching a happy moon ride. Come away from the city, with the tarmac so dead and the people so sad. Come away from the city, with the faces so grey, with the pain of the everyday. with the mountains and the trees. Can you see what I mean? Can you see what I mean? When we fade in between the earth and the sky, kiss the city goodbye, wave the city goodbye, wave the city goodbye, wave the city goodbye. Watch the firelight dance with me, 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 watch the firelight dance.